wanted to learn more. People wanted to use this time productively. And we realized that while a lot of conversations, and very rightly so, a lot of conversations were going on about health and safety, um, education kind of seemed to be the topic that a lot of people didn't think of. And the education sector did get affected a lot. We know that a lot of schools have faced a lot of attendance issues where many children who are not able to afford education anymore have left schools. And we wanted to touch upon all these topics, talk about how online schooling can work, how inclusive this whole process can be. And we started the Nirman lecture series with this aim in mind, to talk more about education, to bring more people into the conversation, have these conversations with parents, educators, teacher trainers all over the world. And today we have over 50 people joining us from all over the world, different parts of the country, from many small towns, big metropolitan cities, and I'm really happy to see the turnout. Um, our speaker today for the session is Professor Nita Kumar, and she will be talking to us about the new education policy. She's the director of NIRMAN, she's the founder and director of NIRMAN. And I joined NIRMAN just a year ago, and the intention was to work with her, somebody who has been an educator for almost 30 years and more, and who has taught in places right from schools to university, somebody with that kind of an experience. So it has been an honor to actually have worked with her for the past year. And she will be talking about the idea of inclusivity, which is a big question that the NEP has brought with it. So uh, I call upon Neeta ma'am to please start the lecture. At the end of the lecture, we will have question answers. So I request you all to pin the video. There will be a thumb pin sort of a image right next to her name. So please pin the video so you can watch it. Neeta ma'am, over to you.
Thank you, Ankita. Just confirm for me once if I'm actually in the addressing mode and the presenting mode. Yes?
Yes, you are audible and you are visible. Yes, we are
Okay,
good to
good,
go.
good. Yeah, sometimes you can err on the other side. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. We are getting together after a fairly long time. We had a gap of more than a month after doing 3 in a series in, I think, June it was. And I thank my team very much for putting it all together, including Ankita, who just introduced me. Now, there are many ways to begin, and I'll tell you that the title I had put for this particular lecture was actually based on this classic film called Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. And if you haven't seen it and you like dark humor, then I recommend it highly. It's a razor sharp analysis of a common psychological trick or process, which is if you say something many times in repetition, and if lots of people say the same thing, then it comes to have the status of a truth, and it comes to be accepted and indeed defended by people as if it was a matter of fact and a natural occurrence. In that film, it's the nuclear bomb, which at first seems such a terrible thing and then later comes to be completely a normal thing. It's very interestingly worked out. In place of this bomb, I feel we do have a similar thing ticking away at the very heart of Indian society, which is the problem of inequality. I usually call it hierarchy, social hierarchy, because that includes within it different kinds of inequalities. And the ones that I will focus most on are class and partly gender and caste where it overlaps. But mostly I find that the issue of class or socio-economic power is the all-encompassing kind of division that I am worried about. And how to stop worrying and love the bomb, where does it fit in? I think that what is happening in India is that hierarchy has already been long prevalent. And even though in our constitution in 1950, we have done away with most practices associated with it and taken many, many proactive steps to provide for equality among Indian citizens, it is a far cry from the actual execution of that policy document. And with passing time, and this is only our third educational policy. The first one in 68, the second one in 86, and this is the third one. The reiteration of certain goals and the exclusion of certain other goals becomes, through passing time and through the repetition through the decades, something that comes to be more and more normal and less challenged. So I want to do a bit of worrying today and incite you all to worry with me and with us here at NIRMAN about this question of inequality and social hierarchy. There is a very well-established analysis in sociology and anthropology of India on the question of hierarchy. We are not the inventors of it. We are not the sole practitioners of it by far. Everyone in the world has that same problem. However, the case of India has been really well studied and analyzed. And I want to just touch on two approaches to it. One is a rather infamous one by the French sociologist Louis Dumont, whose great classic work is called Homo Hierarchicus. If you heard that correctly, Homo Hierarchicus implies that human beings in South Asia, that is India, are somehow essentially hierarchical. And the contrast, of course, is, say, with Europeans who are Homo equalus. And Dumont's work is academic, so he is making a study of the caste system. But what he's showing is, what he's trying to demonstrate is, that actually the caste system is right within as an essential part of Indian thinking. And that's why he is so bold as to use that term. It is a very provocative term, and his work has spawned as many, if not more, critics than admirers and followers. But of course, from many people, he has been torn to shreds. And I just want to mention one particular criticism, because before we move on to my next scholar, which is that had India been essentially in some trait-linked manner hierarchical, then we would have had no movements within our own long history towards equality. And that is simply not true. There have been long, well-developed, long-lasting, different kinds and complex movements within different strata and at an all India levels. And if you want to think of one, the best one to think of is the Bhakti Movement, starting from the 14th century, going onwards for many centuries, which encompassed North to South India, East to West India, men as well as women, and its reach was amazingly far-reaching. And to this day, the Bhakti saints are venerated as no one else's, and their songs and compositions are dearer to the hearts of Indians of all classes than possibly any other kind of literature or music. And it was all oral. And of course, what the Bhakti poets and saints did was to challenge, among many other things, social hierarchy. So Louis Dumont is in his place, but remember that there is an analysis according to which the caste system in India is so truly entrenched that that's the kind of people that Indians are. A different kind of scholar is, I think, a political scientist, I forget his discipline, Norman Weiner, who in the 1990s published a book called The Child and the State in India. And on the basis of interviews with all kinds of people, including educators, but also bureaucrats, policymakers, and other stakeholders, he makes the proposition that the reason why there is such gross inequality in India and so much inequality in the provision of education in India is not because Indians are not capable of anything different, or they don't wish for anything different, or they can't pull it off, or whatever. He's saying it's just never been tried. There are actually not enough efforts in place to make a case for what the Indians want to do one way or the other. That's very close to my own way of thinking. I think indeed the test is still to come. We cannot judge what we are capable of, what we can do and not do, because we simply have not even touched the surface of all the things that are possible to do. And there is no point in going on about how we are as a people, how we are as a culture, or what our history shows and demonstrates, and therefore what we can do or not do. It's a little bit absurd, because there's so many things still awaiting to be done, so many things to be conceptualized and tried out. So with these two examples of scholarship, let's move on to something very simple, which is very dear to my heart as an inroad into the question of inclusivity, which is, whose problem is it? Now, the new education policy, as I said before, has not invented hierarchy, and it's not even guilty of having particularly stressed it or emphasized it. No, it's a treatment of inclusivity and therefore of inequality or exclusivity. Is that it has taken for granted what is simply just an established paradigm or discourse. You can have your pick. Both those jargon words mean similar things. And it has assumed that there will be two kinds of schooling in India. One is, maybe you can hold for me. Yeah, just give me a minute to put on some lights here. Yeah, it's a little better. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so that by not tackling certain questions, it is taking for granted that the kind of situation we have with regard to inclusivity and exclusivity in Indian education is normal. That's the problem that we have to contend with. Why is it not normal, and whose problem is it? So in 1990, I, together with a group of people, started the school called Vidya Ashram, the South Point, in Banaras, Varanasi, and the organization NIRMAN, which you've been hearing about. The keystone of our effort, the basic philosophy was that education should be all-inclusive, that every child should have access to the same kind of education, which means that my own children went to the school, the children of university professors in Banaras in the university, of doctors and professionals in the city, as well as anyone, maybe a tailor maker's son, tailor runner's son, or a vegetable seller, or a maid servant's son, or someone who had never been to school, first generation learner. Such girls and boys were all completely welcome to come to the school, and they all studied together. Our children, the likes of me and my colleagues, the professionals, it's going to have to be very good, otherwise we will not stand for it. And at the same time, there are all these people who have come to school for the first time whose parents are illiterate. And they are going to sit in the same classrooms, have access to the same teachers and the same kind of curriculum and treatment. So when this happened in 1990, I remember talking to many colleagues and people who were in different walks of life as to what I was doing. And as soon as especially on a social occasion, you mentioned that you have anything to do with education, people love to tell you anecdotes about their own education and schooling. And in some cases, their children's. They think it's a very fun topic just to treat casually. And I would probe a little further and ask them more questions once they had broached this. And I found to a fault, that means without exception, that all people in my kind of social circles were totally fine with their education that they had received and were not in the business of problematizing it in any way as being very, very exclusionary, which it had been for all of them. And their own children were presently at that time going to the best of missionary schools or public schools. None of them, of course, was going to a government school by far. And they were perfectly content with the kind of education the children were receiving. I mean, it's good to be content. I'm not saying they should have been fighting battles all the time. But in our conversation, which I tried to, as I said, stimulate towards a direction of criticism and challenging, they still could not see where the problem lay. And that, of course, is that whenever you have a good, sound education, which leaves you very well equipped for whatever choices you make in life, the trouble is that in India, it's at the exclusion of a lot of people. It's not an innocent choice that your parents make. It's not sort of a random case of the selection of a school because that's where you chose to live or that's where your work brought you or anything like that. It's a life and death game that is being played. And once you select that school, then you are totally committed to worshipping its boundaries and the exclusiveness of the school. So other countries have this problem. We are not alone. One of the interesting things, however, is that most other countries, developed countries, and I'm thinking particularly of the literature I'm familiar with, which is from the USA, from Britain, from some parts of Europe. Most of them are self-critical. They make a big deal about the fact that there are inequalities in the educational system. It's not as if it's completely normal or okay or casual or something that you don't necessarily have to engage with. No, they have written reams on it. There are discourses on it. There are debates on it. There are lots and lots of talks on it. I think that given our size, given the size of our country and the size of our problem, we should have 1,000-fold more discussions of this problematic situation. So one little thing which I recently saw was a documentary by the now famous documentary maker, Michael Moore. Check him out if you're not familiar with him. And Michael Moore made one in which he scathingly critiqued the US system of education. He's very, very good at that. And he does it in a particular way. He will just ask certain questions and answers which bring the conclusion forth without him having to state it. I can't help but think what it would be like if Michael Moore or some such documentary maker who had the acuteness would want to make a documentary on Indian education. What would he see? What would he show? Well, the first thing would be that if he went to government schools, he would find how inferiorized the children there were. There is no government school practically in which the children are made to feel very special, made to feel like individuals, made to feel as if they have a right to the time and the resources and the spaces and all the kinds of learning that a school should be giving children. I'm not going to go into all the problems of government schools. There's plenty written on it. And if you're better served by statistics, please just look at the ASER, ASER surveys for the statistics that will show you glaringly how the learning at different levels in government schools falls behind, which should be the standard level of learning at each level. It's not, however, a problem of public versus private. The next kind of school that a documentary would show would be a private school, which is almost always English medium, so-called English medium, let's say, and it could be small or it could be large. It could be of any dimension as long as it's private. And the larger it is, the more commercial it's going to be, because the working of space and size in India is such that you reap more and more profits from enlarging your size without dividing up the units within which you are serving the children. So a classroom could have a huge number of children, an unreasonable number of children in a private school. And at the same time, this government school I mentioned could have a very small and reasonable number of children. Then on the other side, there would be that the private school has an almost unprofessional attitude towards its children. It's not aware, apparently, of age-appropriate learning, but striving to maximize results and teach by rote at different levels, starting from the raw ages of 3 and 4. Whereas in the government school, what you might well find is that children are actually free to run around and to play and to sit and to dream. So which school is more advanced is a moot question. And then, of course, if you look at the teachers in private and government schools, you'll find often that the government school teachers are actually more trained. They are more skilled and they have a better pool of resources that they can turn to were they to wish to. And many of the private schools use teachers because they don't want to spend too much on them, who have very little training, who may have a smattering of English or smartness or modern appearance or whatever, but they are not trained or skilled beyond that. So I want to emphasize that our problem, which I'm talking about, is not one of public versus private. It's one of a whole bunch of things, which is what we are here to investigate. But the public-private dichotomy is something that we should shelve. And then we will understand where the schools are going wrong in servicing the children. Now, we would come then in this imaginary documentary of ours to the top tier of schools, which are private, all of them, and they are elite schools, they are expensive schools. They all start with a huge, wonderful declared mission. They are set up by either corporations or philanthropists or business people, you know, the kind I mean. They're all over the country now and they have been multiplying very fast. When you visit these schools, then you understand that actually the children there are being taught as you would imagine a good school would teach its children. They not only have an immense number of resources, but they have beautiful spaces, they have imaginative curricula, they have teachers who seem to be interested in what they're doing, they're committed to their work, and they are working away at producing this holistic individual, not just someone who has passed the exams and so on. So we have very concrete examples of good schooling in our country. And we have, to break it up, very concrete examples of how to do every single thing that a school needs to do, from its explicit curriculum of teaching the subjects to its hidden or implicit curriculum of producing individualized agents who are responsible for their own learning and growth, who take interest in matters of the world, who can research, who can debate, who can interact with new situations. We have such people being produced in our own country. I think the question then arises, and here I just want to jump back to my invocation of my peer group when I said that as I talked to lots of colleagues in 1990 upon starting a school, they were also satisfied with their own educational experiences, that there was nothing to talk to them about. So I'm jumping back to that because I felt that there was a problem and I could later give it a name. And the name of the problem is a kind of master-servant relationship, They were fine because the problem that I had been talking about of inclusivity was for them something that was a problem for their servants. It was their servants and their servants' children who could not have the kind of education which they and their children were having. And therefore, it was their problem. And it is this discourse of their problem and not ours, which is the problem, really. So when we come to these elite schools, let's just look at them to see what is going on that is part of the problem. Two things are going on. Firstly, I'd just like to ask that if we have such good schools in our country and we are able to show a demonstration and proof of having good products of good schools, why are we even suffering from any kinds of educational problems? Why do we not just apply what is being done in those schools everywhere? That is to say, we have the answers, we have the approaches, we have the know-how of how to run education. Well, why are we not running with them? And that's when you come against two hurdles. The first one, very, very, very important one, is that in these upper class elite schools, a large part of the work is actually being done by the family. Yeah. Okay. So when we look at our successful schools, the elite schools, which cater to the upper classes, and we see that they are actually successful in what they are doing and what schools should do, then we should just say, well, here we have the answer. We have the solutions in our own country. All we need to do is to apply their approaches and their techniques to all the other schools, you know, and lift ourselves up by the bootstraps. We know how to do it. And that's where we come to a couple of hurdles, which is the large part of the substance of my talk today. The first one is that in these successful schools, a great part of the work that is done by the family of the students. So the students are supported at home from the beginning to the end at every single step in having everything exactly as a middle-class student needs to have, from, of course, their clothes and their time and the punctuality and the various little services that a child needs, to concrete help if they are weak in something, and if they are asked to repeat something or perform something for the school, to learn something, to demonstrate something. The child is not left to his or her own devices. The whole family, and because it's a gendered society, particularly the women of the family are behind the child. So a successful child of an elite school is successful not because the school has particularly devised a way of terrific schooling. Had it done that, its proof would lie in working with any child. It's not working with any child. These are already selected children of families who already have education. So my challenge, which I think any new education policy should try to frame and then we should try to meet, is to devise systems of schooling which can fulfill the needs of first-generation learners. Children who are of illiterate or semi-educated families, children of villagers, of laborers, of all kinds of tertiary sector workers. And if we want to have every child having an education now by 2030, if we want to have 100% education in our country, then we are going to have to devise a policy like that, in which you actually have techniques to teach children who do not have the support of the family at home. In almost every discussion of education, as soon as this problem comes up of why are the families who send their children to government schools, whether village or city schools, why are those families not achieving the results that their students, their children need to achieve educationally? Whenever this question comes up, the answer always seems to lie, the fault seems to lie with the family, that they can't do it. Well, if we know they can't do it, Why do we expect them to do it? Why do we go on and on in this horrible, vicious cycle in having an educational system in which we expect to depend on the family, and then we complain that the family is not able to perform and deliver? Well, actually, the families of poor children, that means all the poor families in our country, the majority of families, are not part of that discourse in which they have to give attention to the child. They're not able to comprehend what that means. It's not as if they all are so busy harvesting or trading or moving around. It's not just a question of time, it's a question of understanding what to do. So we have to face this one challenge very, very squarely. When we talk about how will teachers be trained in the new education policy, my first point would be to say we have to devise training in which actually they're given the ideas, the concepts, the know-how, the skills, and then the resources to deal with first-generation learners. Every single teacher today, everyone that I've talked to, which is in the thousands, complains about those children who come from uneducated and illiterate parents. All of them complain about them, instead of turning back to themselves and say, what should we devise? What kind of curricula and teaching methods should we come up with? So I think that any education policy, in order to be truly new and not more of the same, should have this important aspect or component within it, as to concretely devise and discuss how are we going to train teachers to approach and deal with first-generation learners. And at the same time, we have to change our discourse of education so that we don't go on and on and on blaming and victimizing these families. We have to be able to deal with it professionally, vocationally, as educators, and come up with systems of learning, systems of interacting with children and their families. The second thing which happens in these elite schools is that they are actually kept a little distanced from their surroundings. There is a kind of shift from their immediate individual selves to the global self. So they know about themselves and they are encouraged to understand themselves, to introspect and discover what do they like. And the new education policy has a lot about that. It's a lot about making individual choices, of entering and exit courses of study at different times, of figuring out what you really want to do in which combinations. Let me say, I'm very, very happy to hear that. Let me say quickly that I'm actually very happy that there is something in the nature of a new education policy. At least there has been a discussion and a conversation and an effort. But coming back to the but, when you have, lost my train of thought there. So we were talking about the fact that there is an emphasis on individualism. That's good. But I just want to say the but, that it's a kind of privilege to think about courses of study and choosing different combinations of subjects and so on. We are not going to talk about higher education today, but I'm bringing that in because it is so closely related to schooling. And the problem of inclusivity, which is our topic today, is about when children are not even made that competent after 10 to 12 years of schooling to be able to go on to colleges of their choice, to be able to go on to further courses of study, which they would like to choose. So on the one hand, we have a present emphasis on individualism, which is good. Everyone is an individual and should be thus respected. But please let us share that ideology and that discourse of modernity with all the citizens of the country. And let us try to awaken that same kind of self-pride or determination of the self, or the belief that one can choose for oneself in all those masses which are not the privileged people in our country. So let's go quickly through the three different groups of people: teachers, and guardians and maybe the curriculum or the content of teaching, and look to see whether actually some of the things that I'm suggesting can be achieved at all. And my first point would be that if anyone can claim anything on this subject, it should be someone like myself and my team here. Because having set up in 1990 a totally inclusive integrated school, at the end of the day, after 30 years, we still have made no compromises. Like many, many, many other institutions, we have not taken recourse to now catering more to richer middle-class children and keeping a certain budgeted number of other kinds of children who need scholarships, who need financial aid and all that. No, we have a totally mixed bag of students, and our whole effort has gone into devising curriculum and teaching teachers together with the teachers themselves coming up with ideas, doing it very interactionally, as to how this huge conundrum can be resolved. Can all children actually learn together? Can they actually study together? So yes, my answer is a yes, but a qualified yes, because I think the greater part of the work is still before us, but I do think it can be done. And here are the reasons why. If you look at teachers, what teachers need, first of all, is an awakening of their consciousness. They need to be made completely aware of who they are professionally. Professionally, they are teachers of all children, not of certain kinds of children who are delivered to them on a platter with the full support of the family behind them, who'll always do right, answer right, be present, and so on, who'll have no problems that the teachers have to grapple with. So there's that. But the second thing is one of management. And I think, I know that management people will rejoice to hear this, and it's a hard thing for me to say. I think that actually management plays a huge role in this. And in any case, you cannot expect the same level of work and functioning with lackadaisical management as you can with a very astute and conscientious management. Having said that, and why it was painful for me to say that, is because I do think that the real secret lies in making the teachers aware of the task as being genuinely much more rewarding. That is, when they do teach and treat children as individuals and do it in a child-centered way, when they give them the attention, even in government schools, as do elite private schools. So when they do that, they can't do it just as a job. They can't do it because someone might inspect them randomly, someone might come to peep into their class. That would be a falsehood that children would see through. Children would be able to tell whether the teacher is really committed to them as for who they are, rather than just performing a task. So the management has to be so good at their job that they're able to awaken within the teachers that self-awareness of not only doing what they should do, what the management requires, but of actually starting to believe in it. It might take a long time, but it's a political question, it's a politics. After all, when we declared ourselves a democracy, probably most of the world thought they would not succeed. India is not going to succeed. How can India be a democracy? It's so poor, it's full of villages, it's full of illiterate people. Why did we do it? How did we do it? We made a commitment, and look at the commitment. We chose for our Constituent Assembly a leader who was one of the Dalits and who was a sworn proponent of the benefits of education. Out of the many ways in which you can move out of the particular rung of the ladder that you're at, the whole world knows that one of the strongest, best ways is education. Almost no one can fight with that. So we have a particular kind of commitment to education in India, both from Ambedkar's own presence, both from our constitution, and the fact that an uneducated population was going to commit itself to something called a democracy, which used to be considered by definition something only people of land, money, and education could be made part of. So if we did that, why could we not, with our great, wonderful management institutes in this country and their products, come up with many, many, many smart managers who could in turn produce other smart managers for the management of schools which are child-centered, but which are for the poorer working classes. So management is the second thing. And I think the third thing would bring us to curricula, because again, just as with training in how to deal with first generation learners, we need to actually build up the curricula, which should be concretely mentioned in any new educational policy. I know it has mentioned that there'll be this early childhood care and education sector, and the curricula for it would be now produced by NCRT, I think. But the point is, it sounded very shallow. It sounded very casual, simply because they did not say anything more. The policy did not say anything more, except what most critics have translated as playway methods. And as I've said in writing already, these so-called playway methods are already well established in the whole world. And any teacher who has point is, actually, what are they? What kinds of things do you do with the children? What do you engage in with the children? And I think here we come back to that gap which I mentioned in elite institutions when I said they were closed off. They were individuals and then they jumped to a global kind of identity. We are still not aware enough of our surroundings, and we don't bring it in different creative, artistic, intellectual, literary ways into our curriculum. It's a whole big topic, and I have also discussed it elsewhere. But I want to say that inclusivity in our country would consist also of the curriculum becoming a bit inclusive. So when you start teaching, let's say in kindergarten or grade 1, actually reading and writing to children, you are going to talk to them about the kinds of families and backgrounds and situations that they are actually familiar with, and not only exclusively middle class situations. This will be so good for the middle classes as well. And I think we all know that. I don't have to stress it, but I do want to mention that why is inclusivity even important? It's important for us. Forget about them. Forget about the poor. It's really, really important for the elite. It's really important for the middle class, because we can only be as good as our last citizen. That's how the world is looking upon us. They're not going to be fooled by someone's declaration that we'll suddenly have all these research-oriented universities. My dear, research can begin only when in the first classes, the primary classes, you introduce that idea of thinking for yourself, of searching for yourself, not of having a topic called a research project and then having, little packets of research materials already available. But what is research? Even our present day universities, therefore, many of our teachers are not aware of it. So the gaze of the world may or may not be on us, and we may or may not care for it, but for ourselves only. We need to be so much more egalitarian. And, diversity is the stuff of excellence. Again, I have to tell you this anecdote. There are many, many people whose children study in wonderful public schools, international schools even, and all the best schools. Pardon me if I sound sarcastic about it. I am doing so strategically, intentionally, to make a point. I myself belong to that class, so I'm not going to be such a fraud as to, say it's all bad. No, success lies in it. But what happens is that when these parents imagine that their children might compete and get into, say, a private liberal arts college in the USA or a wonderful university in the USA, they realized that the admissions requires some kind of engagement with outside bodies. That is what we call social service. They call it by different names. And then they get all worked up. And what happens is something like what happened in our school recently. A young lady came and said, I want to teach your children about cleaning up the Ganga. And she got, she was encouraged. We invited her to class. Well, she didn't have a clue how to engage with children, how to do the research on the subject, how to formulate a lesson. And we helped her a lot. We supported her. But to the end of the time, which was several months, she did not understand that she was undergoing a learning process. And she could not. It was too late for her, almost in class 10 or 12, I forget which class she was in, to relearn what this kind of thing would be, both engagement with ordinary people and children and the process of research. And the last turn of the story is that her parents write to ask, please give us this recommendation. And they send us a nice format for the recommendation, just as is required by a US higher educational institution. So we have this huge gap in which we want to make a case that we are teaching excellently and doing great things with our students, in certain institutions at least, and that slowly we will graduate to a point where our institutions will be all of the kind of the best in the world. But if we want to do that, we are going to have to both make the elite recognize that the problem is theirs, ours, not someone else's, and become less exclusive, become really interested in diversity and egalitarianism. And most of all, we have to turn to actually the masses in our country. So my last word on the national education policy, the new education policy and inclusivity, is that we have to start many, many more dialogues as to plug in all those missing gaps and loose links in this policy. And of course, it can be done. We are doing it on a very tiny scale here in Banaras. And I would love to engage with all of you and whoever else you want to invite to talk much more about this, both about the nitty-gritty things about to do with curricula and teachers training, and how to make guardians feel really good about this kind of possibility in the future. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. We have a few questions coming in. Before we move on to the question and answer session, audio disturbance, please put your mics on mute. Thank you so much. So, a lot of her words actually resonated with me. Having worked here for the past year, I was actually able to question a lot of my own inhibitions about working with children, um, so on spread across such a huge spectrum of class and caste, and we have children coming from many different backgrounds here. So in my class I see students whose parents are daily wage earners, and at the same time we have students whose parents have big businesses. So it's very interesting to see how children at the end of the day are just not bothered by these differences. And definitely, as ma'am mentioned, there needs to be a lot of teacher training for this, a lot of consideration about the curriculum. And through the entire year, we have had a lot of different training sessions where we have had people coming from outside, training teachers not just in various aspects of textbook education, but also engaging in things like theater and music to make education more accessible to children. So we also, as I mentioned, that we have children coming from various backgrounds. We have two campuses here. We have one campus in the Varanasi city, and we have a campus in a village called Betawar, which is part of Varanasi district. And we are running a sponsor a child program right now. and we aim to reach 100 sponsors. We aim to achieve scholarships for 100 of these children. So if you would like, I invite you to write to me. And we also have some of our sponsors present here with us right now. So it would be great if you would approach me and we could talk about a potential sponsorship. And if you would like to donate in smaller amounts, we also have a fundraiser going on Milaap. And the good part about that is that Milaap has actually waived off its platform fee for us. So 100%, 115% of your proceeds actually come to us because they're also matching all sponsorships, all donations by 15%. So you could actually create a difference. All your proceeds will be directly put into action right away. And please consider sending me a mail about it. I will be sharing the details here on the chat box. I believe Nita ma'am is ready for the question answers now. So we'll start the question answer session. You were talking a lot about how teacher training is important, uh, even more so now when we're talking about inclusivity. And we have an interesting question about teacher training and how government can actually provide more vocational courses in schools and how teachers can be trained in these. Because as we know, we have subject teachers for each subject. So can teachers also be trained in vocational courses so they can actually help students out? So that is one question. We would also like to know more about the definition of inclusivity. How would we really define inclusivity? And how much do you think that the NEP 2020 is removing inclusivity? So we did talk that it was increasing the divide and we need to start worrying. So how much do you think it has affected inclusivity? Has it completely removed it? And does the curriculum also need to be changed along with it?
Okay, thank you. You can hear me, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So about teachers training and the new plans for more vocational courses. So I am not sure whether we want to plan that the same teachers who are teaching various subjects also teach different kinds of vocational courses. I would think that there is enough of a pool of skilled people in our country to be recruited for teaching, say, courses on carpentry or whatever it is that we select to have in a given school. And I am almost sure that it's not going to work out for a lay teacher to get enough of a skill in any particular branch that she has not yet been pursuing to be able to teach that kind of field of study. And I see no reason for her to do that. It takes many, many years to achieve competence in any field. And that goes for vocational as well as non-vocational coursework. So I would say that there is enough for teachers to be trained in. And the main thing that I think we should introduce within new kinds of teachers training is a self-awareness of both professionalism, which is to treat every child as the same, and also very specific skills in how to actually engage first-time learners, first-generation learners. The second question about the definition of inclusivity. Inclusivity. Okay, so it's a policy or a platform which strives to include groups that are typically marginalized or left out. And very often it's used for those with various kinds of disabilities, but very often it's used for those who are marginalized because of gender or class or sexual orientation. That's the definition. The new education policy of 2020 has absolutely not removed it. It's not even addressed this problem. The older education policies and many government documents used to systematically, you might say maybe only rhetorically, address the question of us as a nation, us as equal citizens, of what the poorer citizens in our country need, and so on. Apart from just a few passing mentions of, say, tribal people or scheduled caste people, very passing mentions, there is no systematic approach in the new policy for inclusivity. That's a big gap, according to me, and according to many other people who have been writing on the new policy. And the third question about, does the curriculum need to be changed? I think the curriculum, if you look at the main subjects at one level, is completely fine. It's a very traditional kind of classical kind of curriculum, and it's global in its status. But curriculum also means how this is delivered in the classrooms. That needs to be changed very radically, because we are not teaching these subjects most of the time in the ways they need to be taught. So you don't really produce enough scientists, because you don't teach science as a process of inquiry, analysis, experimentation. You're not producing very good historians. Actually, that's really a retrograde step in our country, because you don't teach history as something evidentiary, based on evidence, on which critical questions have to be posed, and so on with every subject. And we are losing out on our literature, on our arts, because none of these things is being taught enough. On the books, the curriculum is very good, but in delivery, in the way it is executed in the classroom, it is not. So yes, to that extent, the curriculum needs to be changed, not in the books, but actually in the delivery of it. Other questions?
Yes, thank you. So there's a very interesting question here. Right now in India, we can say that inclusivity is in its nascent stage. Mostly we talk about disability every time we talk about inclusivity. And the question is that how can bodies like NETF, like the National Educational Technological Forum, different bodies like that, how could they refine the educational outlook through technological interventions or other ways? So, how different bodies could basically contribute in making inclusivity a more inclusive term, if you would like to address it that way. Um, the next question that we have is about the language part of the NEP. We know that tomorrow we are going to have a session on this, but the question, I will still throw the question out here. Uh, the question is that with the vernacular languages being introduced, will it be difficult for children to now tackle the vernacular along with English, especially because English is so widely needed right now with employability? So, that is one of the questions that we have. Similar to the first question, we could also talk about organizations like Teach for India, whether they could also solve the resource problem that exists in the field of education. There are 3 more questions, and let's address that in the next batch.
Sure. I didn't get the last one. What did you say about the after vernacular? Actually, Ankita, I'm sorry. I am not able to follow this last question at all.
Yeah, the last question is that do you think that organizations like Teach for India, these organizations, do they solve the resource problem? You were talking that you were talking about a resource problem that exists. So do you think organizations like that could address resource problems in education?
Yeah, well, honestly, I don't know. I don't know what resources they produce. And if they are, resources are 2 or 3 kinds, right? They could be the approaches, the teaching techniques. Those are very important resources. So if there is a body of such resources being produced as to how to actually teach in different kinds of classrooms and with different kinds of student bodies, then that is exemplary. That is wonderful. Then there are all these kinds of materials, the curriculum materials. Those are also teaching resources. And those are now, as I think for Teach for India, They are often uh, technologically very advanced. So you could use online platforms and you could use various kinds of technology. That is, of course, possible. I think they are making a huge contribution. I'm just not sure about the replicability of it, how far it could reach, how many it could involve. But that's no way, no reason to dissuade ourselves from going in that direction or trying it. I want to say one thing about technology, which I hope will address the first question, which is that um, I am waiting for all those different kinds of groups, institutions, bodies that are that are working on technological advancement in education to come up with something that would be very specific to our population, that would actually be meaningful in the kind of situation that we are in India. Otherwise, we are still confined to a relatively small group. Now, the Indian population is so huge that when you talk about this quote unquote small group, it's a huge number that we're talking about. And yet, by our own criteria, it's a small group. It's not even half, let's say, of the school going population. So, if we could even reach half of our school going population, which would be somewhere over 100 million children, then we would be able to appreciate that kind of technological advancement. About the question of vernaculars, can we teach? I'd rather just keep it for tomorrow when we can look properly at the language policy of the language part of the new education policy and talk about the pros and cons of English versus so-called vernaculars.
Yeah. So, Asmita, please join us tomorrow to get your question answered. Um, we have two questions very different from each other. One in line with teacher training, that we did speak a lot about teacher training, but how important is it that we address problems about teacher workload, remuneration, workload from periodic assessments, evaluations, as well as teaching in class? So that is in line with the idea of teacher training. And the second question is that, do you think the current idea of individualism, the idea of individualism and the idea of choice are rooted in the market, and do they originate from neoliberalism? The ideas of individualism and choice, if they are rooted in the market, and whether they originate from neoliberalism. There may be a choice, but does everyone have the same agency to make choice?
Yeah, thank you. Very nice
Yeah.
questions. Um, for teachers, now, I actually am very, very empathetic to teachers, and I feel that teachers should teach. They should not have a whole lot of other things to do. And I see no very good reasons if various government policies have tried to make teachers much more excited about their work by increasing their salaries and benefits, have provided other kinds of facilities for them, have tried to improve the discourse about government teaching, and various kinds of initiatives have been started and improvements in the layout of schools and the functioning of schools and all that. When all this has been tried, I see no reason why the government should continue. And I believe it's not. It's going to discontinue having teachers, government teachers, fulfill other kinds of job requirements. So they don't have to be involved in things like census and all that, as far as I understand. So if they can be allowed to focus only on teaching, then you could have them much more responsible and take the responsibility and face the consequences, if not, for good teaching, for a certain kind of teaching that could be then evaluated, assessed, approved, graded, whatever, however we want to approve it and assess it. But until you have yourself provided a kind of escape hatch, that there is always this quote unquote excuse that could be presented by saying, oh, we are so busy doing other things. That's the load that they are always complaining of. So remove that load and then try to seek the results. I agree with teachers who complain, and I think that even if they're not doing too well in many things that they are doing in the classroom, This is not their problem. This is someone else's problem, which they have created and they should take away. About individualism and choice, yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword. Now, you didn't say that, I'm saying it, but I'm saying that there are two ways to look at it. If you don't have it, if you have some kind of a feudal structure, a pre-modern structure, where the community is all important and everyone is a member of the community and you feel one with the larger unit, and you don't have so-called individualism and choice, I don't think you and I would want to live at that time, in that period, and be people like that. I think privately, we all want to be individualistic, and we understand, and we indeed protect, we are very defensive about individualism and choice. It's when we see certain kinds of rhetoric, and especially certain kinds of consumerism, marketing, and a discourse of modernity, which is mostly the performance of modernity, not the reality, not the authentic thing of modernity, that you wonder, what is the value of this individualism and choice? It's all about certain people's agency and choice, certain people's individualism, and it's not extendable to others. So at the heart of this kind of discourse in India lies a very, very, very severe problem, which is that it's only for some people. It's really exclusionary. I agree with you that it's a neoliberal discourse, and one which is being promoted further and further in very artificial manners and very injurious manners. So that I could, for example, cite the case of a young person who, say 10 years ago, felt that she had, all she had to do was to work hard, study hard, dedicate herself to her work and to the rules which comprised her work, and she would be able to become successful to some extent. 10 years later, what she is a victim of this kind of marketing and discourse. And through all the messages on television, social media, and everywhere else, the advertising and the plethora of images and talk, she thinks, she's completely confused. She thinks she can actually achieve something by only consuming certain products, by exercising certain quote unquote apparent freedoms, by possessing a phone, a smartphone, by consuming certain things. So the whole relationship is lost between the actual agency which a person has when they have the grounding and also the economic freedom and the skill level to achieve that grounding and that economic freedom. All the three things are tied together. When they don't have that, then just the message of some kind of individualism is very hollow and empty.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We do have a few more questions, but we are running out of time. We are already 10 minutes past 7:30, so I would like to end the session here today. Thank you so much for joining us. All the questions that I have received, I will be sharing them with Nita ma'am, and we'll get back to you privately. Thank you so much for sticking with us. And I'm sharing a link to Nita ma'am's blog here. She has shared her thoughts about the new education policy on her blog. So do give it a read and let us know how you like it. And we are very excited to see you tomorrow again.